Pat was senior advisor to the Timor-Leste Truth and Reconciliation Commission between 2001 and 2010. He was working altogether in that country from 1999 until recently, and helped to establish and also advised the CAVR, as it's called in its Portuguese acronym, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Currently he's a consultant to the post-CAVR Secretariat. He's written widely on Timor-Leste for more than 3 decades, and was also the founder of the magazine Inside Indonesia, as well as director of the Human Rights Office of the Australian Council for Overseas Aid. For his services to Timor-Leste and to humanity, he was awarded the Ordem de Timor-Leste in 2009. So we're extremely privileged to have Pat with us as a remarkably informed and knowledgeable and accomplished speaker on this particular subject of the Timor Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So thank you very much, Pat, for joining us. We're very privileged to have you, and looking forward very much to your talk.
Thank you very much, Andrew. May I start by thanking Todd Wiedemann for his assistance in getting us here, and hospitality and generosity, and through him the Pacific Peoples Partnership, particularly April Ingham, the Executive Director, and of course Helen Hanslow and members of the University of Victoria Centre for Asia Pacific Initiatives. And to all of you for coming. Thank you very much. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land. This is particularly appropriate because I was invited to Canada, my first visit to your beautiful country, by your Truth and Reconciliation Commission for its forum last week in Vancouver. As you're probably aware, the forum was convened to hear experiences from outside Canada, including Timor-Leste, or East Timor, that might assist the TRC in the design of its mooted National Research Centre, which will be dedicated to educating the Canadian public on the impact of the Indian residential school system over the last 100 years or so. I found the forum deeply moving and also profoundly enlightening, and I'm sure all the other foreign participants felt the same, and I've no doubt it will have the same effect on any Canadian who is not aware of what happened as a result of the residential school system. I grew up in rural Australia, in fact a province called Victoria, and as a child I fed on comic books and westerns, originating from the US of A, of course, but they invariably depicted North American Indians in the most primitive, negative, horribly caricatured way. So it was profoundly enlightening. Of course, I've shifted over the years. I don't want to suggest this was the light on the road to Damascus, but it was profoundly enlightening to have that image burned into my subconscious CD, completely turned on its head last week, and to hear and meet extraordinary native Canadians who were victims. We use the word victim in East Timor, though they prefer to describe themselves as survivors, and maybe that is something we can talk about later, which term is most appropriate. To meet extraordinary Canadians who were victims or survivors, not the bloodthirsty, brutal perpetrators portrayed in the comics of the 50s, and, I have to say, to face the fact that cultural genocide has probably been committed in your beautiful country, as it has in Australia. It was also deeply disturbing to realise yet again the extraordinary power of information, or if you like, propaganda, to shape minds and relationships. I mean, who in the world associates Canada with genocide, or Australia with genocide, or would bracket it with Germany, Rwanda, Cambodia and the rest of it? It was said repeatedly by the academics there, the TRC people themselves, and particularly the survivors, that the rewriting of the residential schools chapter and what it broadly represented in your history is not only a big challenge ahead for the TRC, but will make Canada a better place. Timor-Leste and its Truth Commission, which I'm sort of representing here, faces a similar challenge, particularly in relation to Indonesia, where the general public remain blissfully ignorant of what the Indonesian military really did in Timor-Leste, and the military themselves consider they are heroes. So in Timor we have monuments to the Timorese heroes who resisted the Indonesian military, and in Jakarta you have the Seroja monument, which glorifies the ABRI soldiers, the Indonesian military, as heroes. So they're really much the same impact as the US comic book characters of the 1950s. I don't know whether you remember these names, but the Tom Mixers, the Hopalong Cassidys, the Lone Avengers, and the rest of them that we heard about when we were kids. I think that lack of understanding, that negative perception, is still alive and well. And I was struck listening to Barack Obama introduce Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard on CNN a couple of mornings ago, referring to what Australia and the US have in common. And he singled out the wide spaces and the pioneering spirit of both nations. It was, I thought, having just come from the TRC forum, a rather insensitive throwaway line, because it came pretty close to saying that both nations were terra nullius before Europeans arrived. That's also the dominant view of indigenous Papua in Jakarta, and how Papua is being promoted by the travel industry in Australia. At the same time, I want to say in this context, I was very impressed by the large number of academics who attended the TRC forum, and I was impressed by that because I think engaging the intelligentsia and the education system, whether in Canada or in Indonesia, and as you'll hear, this is very much my agenda in Indonesia, is, it seems to me, critical if minds and attitudes are to be transformed, and that was the word being used at the TRC forum, providing, of course, if I may be so bold, that academia actually delivers. On the way to Canada and the TRC forum, I attended a UN seminar in Geneva on, UN loves long titles, this was it, on experiences of archives as a means to guarantee the right to the truth. That sounds pretty esoteric, but the idea actually comes out of the experience of disappearances in Argentina. It's being promoted by Latin American NGOs through the international community, the UN system in particular, and the government of Argentina has picked it up and is running with it in the UN system formally. My role in the seminar was to share lessons learned from Timor-Leste. The idea is pretty simple, really. It's to acknowledge and promote two things. A, that victims or their relatives have a right to the truth, particularly in relation to human rights violations. And that right, as the UN resolution rather neatly puts it, is to seek, receive and impart information. to seek, receive and impart information on human rights violations. Sounds pretty simple, freedom of information, key in the search, use the search engine, and it's all there. But try it in Indonesia, try it in West Papua, and you realise you're up against massive challenges. So the associated obligation, the associated part of the recognition of that right is the obligation of governments to preserve and make documents accessible, particularly in post-conflict contexts. Now, we've had a Truth Commission in East Timor. We got no cooperation from the Indonesian government. On the other hand, we didn't get blocked. They didn't threaten to withdraw their embassy from Dili. They didn't threaten to stop East Timorese students studying in Indonesia, and good on them for that. Terrific. But we didn't get access to the information that is vital to establishing the truth about human rights violations, who did what to whom and why. Nor did the bilateral Commission for Truth and Friendship, the second Truth Commission that East Timor undertook, that second one in active collaboration with the Indonesians and the Indonesian government, particularly Department of Foreign Affairs, nor did they get cooperation, despite its auspice under both presidents, President of East Timor and President of Indonesia, SPY, nor did they get access to those documents on the part of the military. So, it's pretty obvious you know Indonesia enough about the place and enough about all these regimes to know that that's where the truth lies. They control the truth, and of course they have massive interests to protect by denying access to it. So this is all airy-fairy, sort of obvious motherhood stuff, but to get it acknowledged by the UN and the member states of the UN, and then to transfer it into domestic legislation, get it challenged in the court, supported by the legal profession in country and so on, are the steps down the track if you get this principle acknowledged. Because to deny access, to deny victims the right to seek, receive and impart will be, in the long term, a violation of their human rights, therefore challengeable in the judicial and other system. I just want to add that alongside that, the Human Rights Council, through the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, is spearheading an initiative to have each 24th of March proclaimed as the International Day for the Right to the Truth concerning gross human rights violations and for the dignity of victims. And that too is a Latin American initiative, March the 24th being the day on which Oscar Romero was murdered in El Salvador. Both projects, the Declaration of the Right to the Truth and the institutionalisation or the anniversary, March 24th, are still to be addressed formally by the UN General Assembly. I hope, of course, that Canadian civil society and the Canadian government will champion both, both in the UN and through procedural measures that might follow to have these things implemented. And I hope too that it will actually influence the practices of the UN itself. As I pointed out to the seminar in Geneva, none of the UN interventions in East Timor in 1999, the 5th of May agreement signed in New York between Portugal, the UN and Indonesia, that allowed the act of self-determination, the popular consultation, to go ahead in August 99. None of the Security Council resolutions, including those that established UNIMET to actually facilitate and oversee the act of self-determination, or UNTAET, which followed it under Sergio Vieira de Mello, under whose administration the Truth Commission was established, or the Commission on Human Rights itself, which held a special session on East Timor, similar to the one they held last week on Libya. None of those interventions required the principals, Indonesia, the Australian-led Intervet Force, Portugal or the UN itself, to preserve and make available records on human rights violations. As a result, we're, I was going to use an Australianism, is it all right? We're pushing shit uphill with a rake, or rowing barbed wire canoe with only one paddle is a variation on that. This is a very difficult process, though, as you'll hear. When I finish my remarks, I'm confident we will achieve this objective with the assistance of Indonesian, the agents for change in Indonesia itself. Associated with that, so I just want to say that the departing Indonesian military and its militias either took or destroyed all their archives, with the result that, unlike the Stasi prisons in former East Germany, for example, not one file was available to the Timor-Leste Truth Commission when we took over the former political prison in Dili as our national office in 2002. But we've made recommendations in the CAVR report, the Truth Commission report, that Indonesia make these files available, and we've made broader recommendations to the international community generally, including, dare I say, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Vatican, Moscow, Beijing, who were all permanent members, those last two being, of course, permanent members of the Security Council during the worst years for East Timor, to make their records available. And as I'll say in a minute, I hope that something similar will happen here in Canada. I want now to say something about the Truth Commission and its origins, its work and the challenges ahead particularly. I assume you probably, most of you have some background in East Timor, but I might just try and encapsulate it very quickly. Timor's a dot of a place on the map, about an hour and a half flight from Darwin, but very physically in the Indonesian archipelago. It was a Portuguese colony for many, many generations, depending on how you define colony, probably several centuries. It was occupied by Australia and Japan, who fought a bit of the Second World War on East Timor territory, and something like, we don't know the figures, but something like 60,000 Timorese lost their lives then, and Australia bombed Dili to try and get at the Japanese towards the end of the war, so there was quite a bit of physical destruction as well. Portugal then returned, and in 1960 the UN General Assembly said the East Timorese people are a colony of Portugal, a non-self-governing territory, and they have a right to decide their own political future, and Portugal, as the administering power, should prepare them to exercise that right, which meant build some roads, communication system, beef up the education system, which was virtually non-existent. In other words, allow every adult who would have a right to vote to make a fully informed, responsible choice about the future. Portugal was under a dictatorship at that time, and it basically told the UN to clear out. It did not cooperate. Timor still suffers from the legacy of generations of neglect, and particularly neglect during the latter years of the Portuguese regime. Many people would blame Indonesia for the severe human capacity problems that are really making life, making the challenges for the East Timorese government so difficult now. But I think one also has to look at the neglect, which was not just sometimes described as benign neglect, mainly because they were so slack on the part of the Portuguese that preceded the Indonesian period. But in 1974, there was a coup, regime change in Portugal, and suddenly the Timorese, the window was open to self-determination, the formation of political parties, and absolutely clear now that the Timorese were not ready for that. If Portugal had fulfilled its obligations, or dare I say, if the international community, UN member states and civil society had been more active from 1960 through to the 70s, perhaps the terrible fate Timor suffered would not have occurred. But that's history, and regrettable though it is. So regime changed in '74. It was left-wing in Portugal. The party that sort of got off to the quickest start and the highest profile start was Fretilin. And Fretilin stands for Revolutionary Front for an Independent East Timor. So you put those two things together, plus the fact that Saigon had gone to Ho Chi Minh, things were looking pretty unsteady in the Philippines, China was rising, and all the rest of it, and that scared the pants off Jakarta, particularly Suharto, who of course was in power largely because of his anti-communist credentials, and everybody rallied around him and Indonesia as a result, including Australia and Canada. October '75, Indonesia tried many strategies before it engaged in military activity, but in October '75 it infiltrated into East Timor, and that developed into full-scale invasion in late '75, and the place was occupied by the Indonesians until late 1999. And in the process, the Timorese resisted, and they suffered enormous loss of life, human rights violations, dislocation, and all the rest of it as a result. The issue facing the new government when East Timor was under the UN from late '99 until about May 2002. So the issue facing that government and the incoming independent government of East Timor was, what are we going to do about the massive backlog of human rights violations that were perpetrated here in '99 and in the years before '99. In very summary terms, there were sort of three options. There was the put them all on trial option, sometimes referred to as the Nuremberg option. The problem is East Timor had not beaten Indonesia on the battlefield. Indonesia had, in a sense, voluntarily withdrawn, and it had taken, as I mentioned, a lot of the evidence with it. So that option was not a really possibility. The other extreme was, there's nothing we can do about it, let's forgive and forget and move on. And that was regarded as unacceptable. The wounds were too fresh, people would not accept that, and it would be detrimental to the nation-building objective of building a state based on respect for human rights, rule of law, etc., if you were just to ignore all the abuses of the rule of law that had occurred in the very recent past. So the decision was to prosecute, but not to prosecute everybody. The crimes committed were divided into two categories, serious crimes and less serious crimes. And the serious crimes were defined as murder, torture, sexual violence and rape, and command responsibility. And the UN, which was then the government, said we will investigate and prosecute and jail in relation to those offences. All the other offences were given to the Truth Commission that I'm here to talk about, CAVR, Comissão de Acolhimento, Comissão de Acolhimento, Verdade e Reconciliação. So the Commission for Reception, Truth and Reconciliation. Reception, the Portuguese word was acolhimento. It's a reference to the gospel story of the prodigal son, the young guy who goes off and has a great time, and then his father receives him back. But it was particularly designed to appeal to the 250,000 or so Timorese who'd gone across the border into West Timor, so across the land border between East Timor and Indonesia to say we will receive you back. And in a sense, okay, you may have done something wrong or whatever, but you are welcome in this new society. And the message coming particularly from Shanana Guzmao, who rebuilt the liberation movement around the inclusivist principle of everybody's got a role to play. It's not just one party or the guerrillas, it's everybody can play a role in their own way. The message was, we need your talents, your resources, human capital and all the rest of it if we're going to rebuild this country successfully. And we need to address divisions in our society if the whole thing isn't to be white-anted or ruined from the start, because people will engage in payback and revenge and so on. So the idea was a measure of justice through those two mechanisms, the serious crimes process and the less serious crimes process, but with a view on restorative justice and reconciliation. So that's roughly the origins of the CAVR, as I call it. I just want to say three things about what CAVR wasn't. First of all, it's not a porn site. If you Google CAVR, the chances are you'll come up with audio, something, adult video, C-A-V-A-D, and what it brings up. As much as obscene in the CAVR report, but the institution wasn't an adult video site. Second, CAVR, and this is most important, was not a UN project. We were set up when Sergio Vieira de Mello, who was later killed in a suicide bombing attack in Baghdad, was head of government on behalf of the UN, but it was not a UN project. The CAVR was run by 7 Timorese commissioners, and its genesis very much lay in the CNRT Congress held in Dili in 2000, which was all about rebuilding the state with everybody playing a role. And we also employed significant indigenous ritual and other components in the reconciliation process that the Commission was mandated to facilitate. And I think the indigenous character of the process was very successful, or was a reason for its success. Thirdly, and associated with that, I think it's important to say we were not a clone of Desmond Tutu's South African Commission. We talked a lot to those people, and the decision was not to try and facilitate reconciliation for serious crimes, and not to offer amnesty in return for full disclosure on serious crimes. And we put a lot more focus than I think happened in South Africa on local, low-level reconciliation processes, bringing communities back together, stabilising them so there would not be payback at that very grassroots level. The analogy with South Africa that some have made, particularly the media, because it's the only reconciliation commission they've ever heard of, they say it must be like the South African Commission. The analogy is also a bit harmful in that many human rights NGOs and victims are a bit suspicious of talk about reconciliation, because it seems to suggest that you're not on about justice. So we were keen not to dispel any suggestion that we were simply a carbon copy of the South African Commission. Lastly, there is a perception around perhaps that the CAVR institution and its report were rejected by the East Timorese political leadership. The fact is, we enjoyed excellent support throughout our work, and the post-CAVR Secretariat, which was established after the dissolution of the formal commission in 2005, was set up by the then President, Shanana Guzmao, and is now funded by the Government of East Timor, and its role is to disseminate the CAVR report. And President Ramos Horta has described CAVR as an extraordinary endeavour, and I concur, and its report as an encyclopedia of our history, rich in suffering and teachings that East Timorese must learn from to avoid future crises. He said that in 2006, or 2007 rather, in response to the crisis that afflicted Dili in particular in 2006. So I just wanted to mention that we had excellent auspices and a lot of political and other support during our period of operation. We've run into a bit of trouble since, because in our recommendations we say the Indonesian military should be held accountable. But that is politically problematic and a bit of a threat to the excellent relationship that Dili and Jakarta enjoy at this point of time. I'll come back to that. We were required to do three things. First, to seek and establish the truth about human rights violations on all sides, impartially, objectively, committed during the period 74 to 99. There was some unease about that, fear that it might alienate foreign donors on whose goodwill and money we depended completely, because there was no Timorese government, no tax system, no treasury. They might be a bit embarrassed at the idea of having their rather pathetic records on East Timor exposed to the public, including the East Timorese who stayed in East Timor during the 24 years of Indonesian occupation, that had no idea of what role Canada had played, or Australia, etc., etc. So there was concern about that, but mainly concern that it might open up old wounds and actually create conflict at the grassroots level, when on the other, and be in contradiction to the other objective, which was to settle communities down and create reconciliation between perpetrators and victims at that level. It was also incredibly ambitious to try and document 25 years of history, because it was very controversial, very complex, and there were many players involved. But as I think I indicated, we had very good cooperation from donors, and Canada was a donor to CAVR. We cast our net very widely, and we listened to as many people as we possibly could. And at no stage were we required to use our rather extensive powers of search and seizure. Our work included the conduct of 8 public hearings, broadcast simultaneously on television and radio, such as they were in East Timor in 2003, 4 and 4, when we did this work. And we interviewed or took statements from around 10,000 East Timorese, including the top leaders or the key historical actors, as we call them. That primary data is unique because Timor is an oral society. They have not written much, they don't read much. Information is conveyed orally from generation to generation. We were very committed to putting it on paper, because in addition to this being an historical record or a family record in relation to what Big Brother or father or mother had been through, we were concerned to establish a criminal record. All of that data is stored in the archives in Dili, and we have copied a large part of it to the British Library in London as part of its Endangered Archives program, to make sure that it's very safe offshore, and that eventually it will be accessible to international researchers. That might sound rather obvious, but the fact is our premises were raided by a mob of 100 gun-toting people in June 2006. They stole all the commissioned motorbikes, and there was great fear they might come back and ransack the archives, if not for political purposes, just to hook off with the computers, to sell them in the marketplace, and all the rest of it. In response to that invasion, the UNESCO, the UN Secretary General Special Representative Dili at the time, Australian Government Defence Minister, and ultimately Australian troops who were stationed in East Timor responded very positively, and our fears of an invasion of the actual inside of the premises were not realised. Our second mandate was to facilitate community reconciliation. This was definitely our most innovative and interesting work. and we believe it's generally been successful. And because of its interest, we've had it's attracted quite a bit of attention from a number of governments and non-government organisations in the region. In Indonesia itself, from Papua and from Aceh particularly, but also from Sri Lanka, Burma, Palestine, Nepal, the Solomon Islands and the Maldives. And the Solomon Islands, as you probably know, has set up its own Truth and Reconciliation Commission in response to the troubles they had there some years ago. So it's been a nice contribution that Timor, through this quite unique and creative process, has made to other societies struggling with troubled pasts. Let me just say a bit how this worked. It involved us bringing together perpetrators of less serious crimes, perpetrators of serious crimes are not eligible, and their victims and communities. And about 1,400 individuals benefited from this process in all districts of East Timor, but only in relation to violations committed in 99. And we simply didn't have time or the resources to go to 98, 97, all the way back. But because those violations were freshest in people's minds and the ones most likely to recur if they were not addressed, we focused on them. The process was voluntary, it was very public, interactive, and it had the force of law. Perpetrators who came forward voluntarily were required to make a written statement or confession, which then had to be cleared by the Office of the General Prosecutor before CAVR was given the green light to proceed. Deponents or perpetrators, who were typically young male former militia members, were then required to repeat their confession in the presence of the offended community and victims, who had right of reply, and they had to satisfy those present, the perpetrators had to satisfy those present that they were telling the truth, were genuinely remorseful and would not re-offend. These ceremonies were facilitated by a CAVR Regional Commissioner and a panel of local community representatives. So we did not follow the process adopted in Rwanda of actually handing over the process to local conflict resolution mechanisms. We did it, but we did it in collaboration with local community leaders, and we used a lot of their methods or ceremonies. These ceremonies were often held at a site of local significance, such as a sacred banyan tree, and where possible, lisan or adat in Indonesia ritual was used, as I mentioned. A key part of this was to the use of the biti bot, or the woven big mat, which was carried in ceremonially at the beginning of the process and then unrolled on the floor, and the traditional community leaders sat on that, and if the whole process worked to everybody's satisfaction, perpetrators were invited to come and sit on that mat with traditional leaders as a symbol of their reception back into the community, their reintegration, their forgiveness, if you like. But there was also a sanction. Legislation prohibited severe punishment that might violate the human rights of the perpetrator, because we were trying to also inculcate respect for human rights. But in practice, most communities, after consultation with victims, settled for an apology or an act of community service on the part of the perpetrator or the deponent, provided, of course, they felt the guy or the group were sincere, open and genuinely remorseful and committed to making an ongoing positive contribution to the community. That agreement was then registered in the court, and the deponent was given immunity from further civil or criminal prosecution for that particular offence. So the carrots were very much the chance of being brought in from the cold, of being accepted very warmly, genuinely back into the community, as opposed to being always suspect, the chances that somebody might pay you back informally, as it were, somewhere down the track, burn your house down because you burnt their house down, or the possibility that you may be taken to court somewhere down the track when East Timor develops to the point where that's a serious option, etc., etc. So this worked. It had enough that was local in it to be familiar and acceptable to the local community, but it also had the power of the state behind it. It wasn't a court process, but it had judicial status and judicial authority, and victims and perpetrators knew that and realised that they were getting a pretty good deal, and that on balance it was a better option than heading for the hills and trying to hide or pretend you were somebody else, or going into exile in Indonesia. A lot of East Timorese militia remain in Indonesia, but those who came back definitely benefited from this process, and we're pretty satisfied that there have been very few, if any, recidivists as a result. So in 2006, we're not aware that anybody who committed less serious crimes in 2006, and there were a ton of them in Dili, were people who'd been, as it were, forgiven through this process conducted by CAVR. Our last mandate was to write all this up, to report publicly on the work of the Commission, on its findings, including the names of offenders, and to make recommendations for reforms and other measures to uphold the dignity of victims, promote human rights, and ensure that these violations were not repeated. The result was a magnum opus of 3,500 pages, which, with President Xanadu Guzmão's help, was baptised Chega, C-H-E-G-A, which is Portuguese for stop, no more, enough. A bit like that hand that comes up on your pedestrian crossings when you stop on the side of the street. So we added the exclamation mark because we felt, as did of course victims in Latin America who baptised their reports Nunca Mas, that this was the key message coming out of the 4-year work of the Truth Commission. People had had enough of that. We want to see it again, but for it not to recur, there had to be a whole lot of consciousness raising, human rights inculturation, program reform, legislative reform, training of the East Timorese military. The Falentil, the East Timorese military, were established by Fretilin in 1975 as a military wing of a political party to beat another Timorese party. We had to try and Indonesia, as you know, has had a dui fungsi system where the military officially are allowed to engage in economics, have seats in the parliament until the last 10 years or so. But we had to try and get all that out of the heads of the Timorese military and the new recruits, and try and make sure that right from the start they were professional army who respected human rights and the rights of citizens and so on. So a huge undertaking because of the long period and the influence of that period before this. So writing that report was an exacting, time-consuming and exhausting task. But we did it in 3 languages because Timor is multilingual, and we wanted to do it in Portuguese so that the Portuguese public could read it in their own language, and we definitely wanted it in Indonesian so the Indonesian public could have access to it in their own language. And that is critically important because change has to come in Indonesia. This is their history as well as Timor-Leste's, and they need to know the right to the truth, what actually happened, and dispel all the nonsense that has been perpetrated by the Suharto regime in Indonesia about what the Indonesian military was doing in East Timor. So this report contains, in sometimes disturbing detail, the following references to the following human rights violations: self-determination and the international community. We did not devote space to Canada. We simply couldn't write up the record of the whole world, so apologies for that. Although Canadian human rights community receives quite a few honourable mentions in that part of the report. Canada only voted once for Timor during the critical years 75 to 82. Australia, of course, I have to say, didn't do much better. But that's not, Canada didn't cover itself in glory, and it's of course great interest to know why that position was adopted and so on. It also reported on self-determination in the international community. In other words, what was going on outside East Timor, particularly in the UN forums. It reports on killings and disappearances, forced displacement and famine. The report concludes that at least 100,000 civilians died as a direct result or an indirect result of the conflict, and most of those died because of starvation and hunger. They were forced to stay on the run in the bush by the Indonesian military. They exhausted natural supplies. They were not able to garden, and the public hearing we conducted on that issue was certainly one of the most traumatic and riveting, as people described the terrible Sophie's choices they had to make about whether you left grandpa and grandma behind because you simply could not carry them any further through the bush with the Indonesian military hot on your heels, and even people killing their kids because the kids were hungry and started to cry and would have disclosed their whereabouts to the Indonesian military. It's an absolutely horrible, horrible period, and not an aspect of East Timor's history that is well known. We all know about the Santa Cruz massacre in 1991 because it was filmed, about the famine that preceded it. It was an absolute shocker, and in our view, Indonesia is guilty of very serious violations. In fact, we said crimes against humanity and war crimes because of that alone, because it sealed off the place. No international agencies were allowed in until they felt they had completely conquered the place, and they almost did wipe out Franklin and the military resistance by the end of '78. But then CRS, Catholic Relief Services of the US, and the International Red Cross were allowed in, but under very strict control, and significant compromises were made by those two organisations in the process, and a lot of lives were saved. But before they got there, huge numbers of Timorese had died simply because of starvation. We also found that detention and torture were widespread and systematic throughout the occupation. Laws of war were violated throughout the occupation. Political trials were unfair. There was widespread and systematic sexual violence. And I'll just add here that the Komnas Perempuan, the Indonesian Women's Human Rights Commission, has taken that section of the report and the relevant recommendations, published it in a standalone book form in Indonesia, and circulated it widely there, because for them this is all about what the key institution in Indonesia did to ordinary people, and what it did in East Timor was not exclusive to East Timor. It happened in Indonesia itself, and they are desperate to try and get this on the record and have it acknowledged that that's what happened. People, institutions and policies should be held accountable, and change is required, and of course is now possible because Indonesia is in that phase of its evolution. We've got to go.
Can you wrap it up?
Yeah, wrap it up. Where are we now? After being in Victoria, we're in a situation where the Parliament is discussing two pieces of legislation. One, to establish an Institute of Memory. The second, to establish a program of reparations. The Parliament has twice postponed debate on those two pieces of legislation, but we remain cautiously optimistic that they will be adopted in the course of this year, and I very much hope so, because next year East Timor goes to the polls, presidential and legislative, and we might lose this window of opportunity if that doesn't happen. Sorry to go too long.
All right. Thank you very much indeed, Pat.